My name is Bhavin. I am a program director at Trustbridge. Trustbridge is a research organization based in New Delhi, and our work is focused on trying to improve the rule of law for better economic outcomes in India. One of the ways in which we try and do our work is to evaluate the performance of various regulators. These are in the financial markets, these are in the electricity sector, and we're slowly expanding the scope of our work to other areas as well. Given that a lot of information about how Indian regulators function isn't publicly available, there are very few sites where we can actually go dig up material, dig up information, and try and understand whether or not the principles of the rule of law are being followed and promoted by regulators. But there is one such site that is accessible, that is amenable to such study. And for the past year and a half or so, we have been trying to work on extracting information from there. This site is regulatory enforcement orders. And as you might be able to imagine, there is a fairly large volume of orders that is pronounced, that is published pretty much every single working day. And trying to get a synoptic view of this massive volume of material that is available to analyze can be somewhat challenging. I'm going to try and spend the time I have left today to try and explain to you how we have done this in two different ways, both for the same study. The study involved trying to understand the performance of one of our financial markets regulators. And I said we tried to do this in two ways. The first was the more traditional approach of actually physically picking up every single order, trying to read it and make sense of it. And the second approach that we used was to try and use large language models to read and analyze these orders at scale. I'll go into the details of both of these, and we can perhaps at the end of this hour have a pretty good idea of how these two methods stack up against each other. And for those of you who are interested in using LLMs for similar work, perhaps you have a few ideas that you could employ in your own work as well. Before I move on to the exact agenda and the breakdown, I must take a moment to explain the title of this slideshow because it may not be apparent from what I've said so far. We are doing all of this not merely in order to present a snapshot of how things stand today, but we also hope that the outcomes of all the work that we've done and all the research and analysis that we've undertaken can form valuable, implementable policy suggestions, process changes, operational changes that the regulators can implement and that will try and improve the rule of law for the economy in India. With that said, I'm going to jump into the slideshow. Atreya has already said this, but I'll repeat it as well. If you have a question at any point of time, feel free to either raise a hand, or if I don't notice you long enough, just unmute and grab my attention. If you leave me to my own devices, two things will happen. One is we will run out of time, and two is that you will be deadly bored. So in the interests of everyone's sanity, I would urge you to get involved, ask as many questions as you'd like, and I'll try and answer them as best as I can. So this looks like a fairly long agenda, and it looks like there are many, many steps here, but I promise you that each of these is barely about a slide or so. So it's not going to be too dense in any one part. But first, we try and understand a little more about the study that I described. We'll try and talk about some of the challenges we faced when we first tried to use LLMs to do this work, how we found a partner who helped us navigate this thicket of problems, and how they trained us on using what they call their query schema to try and ensure that we were able to do this work in an accurate and efficient manner. There is also a set of processes and methods that we've developed in the course of working with LLMs that sit outside the LLM part of the work, but which we feel are critical in helping us ensure that the results that emerge are accurate and are reliable. And these again are suggestions for anybody else who wants to work with LLMs in a similar manner. We'll then compare the time and costs that were incurred in each of the two methods that I had mentioned earlier. And then what we've learned from this, how we can take matters forward. So the study first. We are interested, as I said, in trying to understand the performance of the securities market regulator, amongst others. And we decided to do this by first focusing on SEBI's enforcement orders in the area of insider trading. We found about 333 SEBI orders in a 20-year time period, which relate to insider trading. And we prepared 57 indicators of two broad types. You could call them either descriptive or case characteristic indicators and what we call rule of law indicators. So the idea is that, in a broad sense, we want to ask 57 questions of every single order that we've studied. These could be simple identification indicators, such as what is the date of the order? What's the name of the officer who pronounced the order? What's the name of the parties involved? And so on. Or these could be substantive questions. If you say that the violation of insider trading has been made out, then here are the 5 or 6 constituent parts of that violation, and have these constituent parts been made out in the order for the substantive violation to be conclusively established. So the indicators could be of both kinds. These need to be collected at both a document or order level and at a party level. What this means is, what is the date of the order is a question that you ask of the document as a whole. But if there are 5 people involved in a matter and each of them has been accused of having committed insider trading, then we need to know a whole bunch of questions for each one of those parties. And finally, we need all of this output in an analyzable CSV format, because we are an interdisciplinary team of economists, lawyers, and data analysts, and a large portion of our work depends very heavily on the quantitative analysis of the data that we extract. Once we're done with this, with the SEBI orders, we also want to try and understand what is the fate of any SEBI order that is appealed. Appeals from the SEBI, for those of whom who may not be familiar with the sector, lie before a body called the Securities Appellate Tribunal, and from there onwards to the Supreme Court. So we believe a good measure of regulatory performance is how well a regulator's orders stand up in appeal. So it's important not just to know what happened at the first instance, but also to try and understand whether the regulator's reasoning, their order, holds up when it is put under scrutiny, either at the SAT or at the Supreme Court. This entire portion of the study, involving 333 SEBI insider trading orders, was done by hand. And I'll describe in a little more detail what that means and what the resources involved were. But onwards to the challenges that we faced even before we attempted to use LLMs. We quickly realized that trying to collect all of this information, which is essentially 57 questions multiplied not just by 333 orders, but by all the parties that are involved in all of those orders, results for a fairly massive number of unique data points. And collecting these through traditional processes is difficult. We had to do this over 2 or 3 different rounds of order reading. So the orders weren't just read once and the information collected. As we went along, we realized that we would have to do the study over a couple of times. And so it took us a fairly long time period, about 7 months to do this. We have a small team and our team was involved in this, but we also needed 7 interns to help us with this entire process. Those interns in turn needed a team of supervisors. And of course, all of this results in costs. We are not a team of technologists. We are not a team which has its own development team. And so we have had to incur costs in, first of all, trying to extract all of these orders from the regulator's website. There are, of course, costs to be paid for the interns and the supervisors and all the other associated overheads. But even with that, even assuming that that isn't the biggest challenge, there were massive problems in ensuring consistency. So if there are 12 or 13 or 15 people reading these 333 SEBI orders, and even if you've gone through weeks and weeks of training, which we did, there was always a very good chance that 2 people would read the same order and record different findings. And this isn't a problem we think that arises because the people didn't pay attention during the training or that there's something else missing in their capabilities. It's simply because of the subjective nature of the information included in those orders. It's entirely possible for 2 people who are thinking absolutely along the correct lines to come up with different findings there. And so there are problems of inconsistency that arise. There are problems of relaying, because there is a group of people who are trying to design the study, who are trying to figure out how we should collect information. They pass this information on to the supervisors in turn pass it on to the interns, and then information has to hop back those 2 steps once again, and there is a lot that is lost in navigating all of these. And so there were very many inconsistencies in the final data that we got the first time around that we tried to do this. And this is why we had to go over this 2 or 3 different times over a 7-month time period. Finally, we came up with a data set that was usable. This is at the SEBI level, but we've still got the challenge left of trying to understand what happened if and when these orders were appealed at the SAT or at the Supreme Court. And so somebody came up with a smart idea of saying, hey, why are we doing all of these? Why don't we just try and use LLMs? These things are fantastic. They're brilliant. They work with text. These should be able to do the job with a little bit of effort. Fine. So we tried that, and we went ahead and we tried feeding a few documents to a few LLMs and asking questions of them, but we quickly realized that that wasn't going to help matters much. Now, we had, in the case of SAT, about 426 orders that we needed to analyze. So remember that there were 333 SEBI orders, and now there are 426 SAT orders. There is a mismatch in the numbers because sometimes parties appeal separately. Sometimes all of the parties involved in a SEBI order may not decide to appeal together. They might decide to split up in groups or individually and file separate appeals. And so there isn't a one-to-one correspondence between these 2 sets of orders. Now, to make matters even more complicated, last time around we had 57 indicators, and this time we have 86. Again, there is a larger number of indicators here because now you need to understand not only what happened at the SAT, but also what was the starting position. So if, for example, at SEBI you asked, I will indeed. So Chandrasekhar, I will share some of these indicators very quickly. I'll try and show you the data set as well. But as an example, an indicator at the SEBI level was a penalty imposed. And so that multiplies into two indicators at the SAT level, because when you're reading the SAT document, you're trying to understand, was a penalty imposed by the SEBI, and was that penalty modified by the SAT? This is why there are more questions to ask as you go higher up the chain than you might have had originally. So, as I said, the scale of the problem now is bigger. We've had a torrid time trying to read all of these orders through this massive team, and that's not something that we want to go through again. So why don't we try and use LLMs to do this? But that has its own set of challenges. Remember that we want our output in the spreadsheet in a manner that is amenable to quantitative analysis. And so to the extent that we can force fit responses into neat categories such as yes, no, or unclear, we want responses only in those formats. So I said that there are some indicators that are identification oriented. So if there is a date that I need, then fine, extract the date. If there's a name that I need, fine, extract the name. But otherwise, I am asking questions such as, was a penalty imposed? Was this element of the violation made out? Was that element of the violation made out? And I want only yes or no answers to these based on explicit language that is available in the document itself. We're not at a point yet where we feel comfortable relying upon the LLM's own subjective interpretation of the language in the document. We're not sure that that creates a set of results that is reliable for the sort of analysis that we want to do. And so we want you to read these documents and only in the presence of explicit language, give me yes, no responses. Where there is no explicit language, just say unclear. Now, I'm sure many of you here have worked with LLMs and you know a ton about how they love to generate stuff. And so most such systems will try and produce answers that are based on inference that may be a little descriptive in nature. And it's extremely difficult trying to constrain their behavior to A, rely only on explicit material, and B, to only reply in one-word phrases such as yes, no, or unclear. And this is something that we weren't able to achieve. Again, you could feed these standard off-the-shelf systems one document at a time, and if the document was short enough, 5 or 6 pages, pretty good. Some orders are much, much longer. These run into hundreds of pages. And as the size of the information that you're giving it to process increases, the chances of inaccuracies correspondingly goes up as well. And that's not a happy situation for us. Errors can occur. We know that these errors are in a certain percentage range. Take your pick, anywhere between 10 to 20%. But the problem for us is that the site of these errors is not predictable. So it's okay if you say that you have a 10% error rate, but I don't know where in this entire corpus of answers that 10% is going to pop up. And that means that I can't go and fix it myself later. So inconsistencies and unpredictabilities in the responses, again, are a problem for us. And if you're going to go through the process of uploading one document at a time and asking it these 57 or 86 questions one by one, then you'd actually finish the job much faster if you just sat down by yourself, said bye-bye to your social life, and just read through these 426 orders over however many months it takes. And so that is inefficient, and that is not particularly helpful either. All of these were problems that we had when we first tried to use LLMs on our own. And so we were lucky enough to forge a partnership with an organization called Lucio. Lucio uses AI to develop solutions for legal professionals. They've been able to come up with wonderful, wonderful solutions for many problems that professionals in the legal industry encounter. And in our case, they were able to help us solve this problem, where, in a nutshell, we would be able to upload a large volume of documents in one go onto a platform, ask those 87 or 100 or 50 or however many questions we might have had one time, and get that CSV output that we wanted in one shot, instead of having to do this one by one for every single document, or one by one for every single question that we wanted to ask, or every single indicator that we wanted to ask. So this was done by using a query schema that Lucio has developed. I'm going to try and describe very quickly what the overall structure of that query schema is, where we plugged in, and how Lucio guided us in that process. And as I said, there is a set of methods, there's a set of tests that we've developed which sits outside all of this, which works with the output that this query schema might generate, and that helps us ensure that our results are a little more reliable and a little more accurate. So I'm going to try and show you quick snippets of the schema. I'm going to try and show you a quick overview of the data set that was generated, and of course, share with you as many indicators that we used as a possible as well. But before I do that, I also want to say that as an organization, Trustbridge is committed to releasing all of the work that we do into the public for anybody who wants to work with it. So the data set that we have collected and which we are cleaning up and finalizing now will be released publicly. The analysis and reports that we generate will be released publicly. We have also done this in the past. We've conducted a similar study of the electricity regulator in the state of Tamil Nadu, and the results, the data, as well as a manual describing all the methods and processes that we followed, is available on our website for anybody who's interested in trying to replicate that work, or if you find it useful in your work. Okay. Let's take a step back and come back to this. So we're now at a situation where I've got 86 questions, I've got 426 documents, and I need to be able to get all of this out in one spreadsheet. That's broad strokes the situation that we're up against. So how do we do this? And how do we do this in a way that doesn't break the bank, that is reliable, and that generates either very accurate results or a set of results about which I have some reasonable certainty of where to look for errors. So if an LLM can't give me more than a 90% accuracy, that's fine. It should at least be able to indicate where the 10% error is likely to occur. So I can go in and fix that remaining 10% by hand. So that's the nature of the beast, and that's what we're trying to deal with. The first step is trying to break down all the information that we're trying to extract from these documents into 4 broad categories, or 4 broad kinds of questions. These are independent contexts, dependent contexts, multipliers, and base queries. I'll walk you through each of these 4. And as I said, I'll give you a quick snapshot of what the schema looks like as well. Let's start with the independent context. The independent contexts are standalone information that you need to extract directly from the order, and for which you don't need to look at anything other than the order. Okay? So if the question is, what is the composition of the bench? That is information you can only find out by looking at the order. And you don't need to know anything else in order to extract that information. Similarly, what is the date of the order? This is available on the face of the order, and this is something that you don't need to know anything else for. How many appeals are involved in this order from the SAT? Who wrote the order? These are examples of what we call independent contexts. There's a small set of these These questions are fired directly at the document. And once again, if you are able to separate these independent contexts out in a reasonably good manner, then you are also able to identify which part of the document this information is likely to appear in. So you would see from some of these, and for anybody who's familiar with how either tribunal judgments or regulatory orders are written in India, that a lot of this information is available pretty much in the first 2 to 3 pages of the document, or perhaps on the last page. So you don't need to query the entire document to get this information. You're working with a smaller chunk, and so your chances of accuracy correspondingly go up. You extract this information, you retrieve it, and you store it. And this is information that other parts of this query schema might refer to. These are the independent contexts. The second category of questions is dependent contexts. Dependent contexts are chunks of information that you need to extract from the document, but you need to know a little bit of information before you can start querying the document. The only other bit of information we have so far is the independent context. So a dependent context is information that you extract from the document, but you need to look at the independent context in order to completely understand what you need to extract. Okay? So examples of these are: what sanctions were imposed by SEBI? How did SAT modify or change these sanctions? And what was the disposition in the appeal? So was the appeal allowed? Was it dismissed, partly allowed, something else? But if I need to do this, for example, if I need to understand what is the disposition of the appeals involved in this SAT order, I should first know how many appeals there were that have been decided together in this SAT order. And that's information I've already collected in the independent context. So this dependent context of disposition will first go look at the independent context of appeals and say, this SAT document has 3 appeals. Now I know this, and now I can go and look for what happened to each of these 3 appeals. I can only find that out from the order, but I need to know something before I start reading the order. And so I am a little more targeted now. I am a little more precise in what I'm looking for. Once again, there's a better chance I'll get it right. These two, the independent and the dependent contexts, are the only questions that we ask of the document directly. So for those of you who are familiar with these terms and these methods, this is the retrieve part of the process. This is the only information you really need to extract from the document. You store it, and all of the other questions that we have will be asked only of this extracted chunk of information and not of the document as a whole. 2 good reasons for that. One, remember we said that the larger the document you're trying to read and answer questions from, the greater the chances of an inaccuracy. And the second good reason is that, once again, the larger the body of information you're trying to query, the larger the costs you're going to incur. And so if you've been able to efficiently pull out the information that you need to refer to later on, both the chances of inaccuracies and the costs will correspondingly reduce. So we've got the independent and dependent context now, and now we've got base queries. Base queries essentially are the questions that we are asking, but before we start asking them, we also need to understand how many times we need to ask a particular question. Okay. So if a base query is, once again, continuing with the example of disposition, was this appeal allowed or dismissed? I need to know how many times to ask that question. That depends on how many appeals there are. I already have that information. And so I say that for the query of disposition, there is a multiplier. The multiplier is the number of appeals that is involved. And so that question needs to be asked that many times. Some queries get asked once, some queries get asked multiple times. The multiplier could be each party that is involved. The multiplier could be each appeal that is involved. Now, this is something that sits again as the third part of the schema. And once you have this information, you can then start asking your individual questions. These individual questions now are asked from the information that we have already extracted and parked in our independent and dependent context. We're not firing questions at the document anymore. So we're looking at much smaller chunks of information and extracting information from them. They may be multiplier dependent. We talked about appeals. There could be sanctions. There are many different kinds of sanctions that can be imposed by the securities market regulator. We need to have a multiplier of the number of parties that is involved. So that's one example. And these questions are written and drafted and checked for accuracies and errors and improved through what I'm sure is a fairly familiar and well-known set of prompt engineering methods that anybody who's been trying to work with LLMs would be familiar with. And so there's a fair amount of trial and error that goes into this as well. That said, we're no longer shooting in the dark, nor are we trying to extract proverbial needles from haystacks, because the pool of information that we're trying to query is much smaller. And so there's a much better chance that we'll get the query right with just a few tweaks. Once you run all of this, and before I proceed, I'll show you what the query schema looks like. I'm just going to take a moment to pull that up. So if you can see that on your screens now, this is what the query schema that I've described looks like. This, of course, is proprietary to Lucio, and so I'm able to describe it in broad strokes for you. And this is also part of the reason why I'm not zooming in too much. But this is
zooming in a little bit. I think some people are having trouble seeing.
So I just explained a moment ago why I couldn't zoom in, but perhaps I'm going to do that, and maybe we can delete it from the recording because this is third-party proprietary.
Sure. No, then we can proceed, Bhavi. Not a problem.
Okay. So maybe we'll just slip this bit out of the recording that we publish somewhere else. So this is written in a format called JSON. This is a data interchange format that is very, very widely and popularly used. And what we're doing here now is we first frame our context. So what you're seeing up here is a group of independent context. This query schema is something that we've prepared for APTEL, which is the Appellate Tribunal for Electricity. There'll be a handful of independent contexts that we have first drafted. These will be asked of the document. Once you've got this information, you can then move on to the set of dependent contexts. These dependent contexts, remember, will query the document, but need the information you have first collected and parked in the independent context. Once you have this set of dependent contexts in place, you can then start asking your individual questions. So I've scrolled through it pretty quickly, but just to give you an idea, you're probably looking at about 10 to 12 across the complete set of independent and dependent contexts. So you're only querying the document 12 times as compared to the 86 you otherwise might. These then are each of the individual questions that we are asking. So for example, what is the appeal number? What is the name of the appellant involved in each appeal? What is the name of the respondent involved in each of these appeals? Each of these might get affected by a multiplier. What is the appeal number gets multiplied by the number of appeals. What is the name of the appellant or what is the name of the respondent gets multiplied by the number of parties involved in each appeal. But each of these queries now is more or less just a 1-2 line prompt. And this isn't dramatically difficult to think up or to refine because you've already done the heavy lifting of extracting useful information beforehand. So these are all the base queries that we have. I'll skip through them very quickly. And then right at the end, you will have a bunch of multipliers that you might need to apply. So this is a multiplier, and this is the set of base queries to which the multiplier applies. And so that's the broad structure of query schema, right? And yes, it's a little difficult to get up and running and to refine in the first go, but once you're done, you're done. And this is something that you use over and over again for all 426 or however many documents you might have. You don't have to repeat this process for every single document that we're trying to work. Now, this gave us a set of results, but the good thing was that we didn't have to go and check the response to every single question on the Lucio system. We ran it in a couple of phases. First, we just ran the independent context that I talked about, and we checked those in order to ensure that all the upstream information on which so much else downstream relies was accurate. That's reasonably quick and efficient to do. And then we ran all of the other phases down the line unchecked and generated the CSV output that I've mentioned. So Pranav, I'll come back to your question later. I'll come back to your question in a bit. The short answer at this moment is that this JSON file is not available, but we will publish all the prompts that we have used for anybody else who wants to tweak them and work with them. That particular format, that particular arrangement is something that works on the Lucio platform and may not be usable elsewhere, but all the actual prompts that were written, we're committed to releasing them and making them available for anybody else who wants to work or tweak them. Go ahead.
Bhavin, I think if you continue, we can take the questions once you're done.
All right, great. I've just got a wonderful segue onto my next slide from a question that came in the chat anyway. So this is all very fine. You did all of this and you got some results, but what was the process of validation? Sure. Recall X% error rate, but important to be able to try and identify where these errors occur. So we're done with the LLM bit now. You've got a massive spreadsheet. I'm going to quickly give you a glimpse of that as well, so that all of this makes a little more sense. So this is an early version of the data set that we got. There's a lot more work that's going on with this, but this, for example, is, and I'll zoom in here. Each of these on top is an example of an indicator, and we've got results for each of these. So you've got appeal numbers, and all the appeal numbers across all the documents that we've looked at are here. In each of these appeals, who are the parties? What type of party are they? Are they an appellant or a respondent? So if you look at, for example, 255 of 2020 here, in the same appeal, there are several different appellants, and you need different responses. You need unique responses for every single party involved in every single appeal in every single document. So that multiplies the number of rows that you have. Some information is just extracted directly. So what are the dates of the order, the show cause notice, etc., all of that. And for a lot of other questions, we want yes, no, or unclear responses, but nothing descriptive. So Lucio's gotten us to this point where with the query schema, we've got all of this information extracted and we've got it in a format like this. As you can see, the answers are constrained to the format that we want. They are to a large extent not inferential. And this is something that we can then analyze at scale. But on to the question of validation now. There are errors here. How do we identify them? How do we know where they are? And how can we go about trying to fix them? So we created a bunch of error checks that we then applied to these results. The first is a fairly straightforward, obvious set of checks, which is a set of keyword checks. So if you say, for example, that in a particular appeal, the order was remanded, then the word remand or the word remit or reconsider must appear within such and such number of words of the order of the word order in the document, typically in the order. And so if you set up a bunch of rules like this, then you're able to spot out the fishy results. Because if you say that there was a remand in a particular matter, that word does not appear, or remit does not appear, then there's probably something wrong. And so this gave us about 91 potential errors out of 780 possible cells in that spreadsheet where this error could occur, which is an 11.66% error rate. Then we created what we call a set of logical errors. Logical errors are sets of findings that cannot possibly exist together. So for example, one of the questions we asked was, did you find the date of the order? And if you say yes to that, then the next question, which is, what is the date of the order, must be filled in. If it's blank, then there's something wrong going on. And so that gave us a slightly less error rate of 10.39%. And finally, what we call flag for review errors. Okay? Flag for review errors seem like inconsistencies, but they're not necessarily problems in the way the information has been extracted. It could just be that the order isn't written well enough for that it doesn't include all this information. So for example, if I ask you the question, was the penalty modified? And you say yes, but for the question, what was the modified penalty that the SAT imposed? Then that this
No, I think his connection. Bhavin, I think we lost you for a minute. Your connection may have frozen. Yeah.
only three certainties in life: death, taxes, and the fact that my MPNL connection will collapse every time I'm making a presentation. So there you go. Anyway, back again. So two things to take away from this set of validations that we did. One is we're pretty happy with these numbers because you run 426 documents through these LLMs and you're coming up with ballpark about 91% accuracy on the first row. That's great. But the other great thing to take away from this is that where is the remaining 9% error? We know exactly where it's likely to be. It's likely to be in these 91 out of 780 cells. It's likely to be in these 1000 cells or in these 15 cells. And this is not done on the LLMs. This is just a set of scripts that we write using Python and that throw up the cells where these errors might occur. So it's a relatively easier job to go in and look at just this subset rather than open up every single document and read through it from beginning to end. Of course, once this is done, there are 3 additional rounds of sanity checks that we did. And so we're reasonably happy with the way the results have come out from there. Okay. What did this cost us? How much time did it take? This is end-to-end 4 months. We have some fixed fee that we pay to Lucio, but without divulging any commercial information that may not be amenable to sharing, I can let you know that it's a lot cheaper than having a large team to do this. And it's a lot more affordable for a research organization like us. So rather than by sanity checks, I just mean that this is essentially a set of samplings. So I've done my validations, I've done my cleanups, I've done these keyword logical flag for review, but I just want to make sure once again that everything is fine and it smells right. And so I will probably pick up between a 15 to 20% sample every fifth order, every 20th order, whatever. Keep it side by side with the results and see if it makes sense. And we did 3 rounds of those. Okay, so I hope that that clarifies that question. The good thing from this, aside from the lower costs and the lower time frame, is remember I said 4 months, but a lot of that 4 month time period is just used in setting up the schema. This is the first time we were doing it, and so we're getting better at it. I showed you the Aptel schema. Once we had done the SAT schema, we were able to draft the Aptel schema much, much faster. And that's also in large measure because there are many parts of the SAT schema that we could just very easily modify and tweak and reuse for the Aptel situation. We're talking about appellate tribunals in both cases. And so many of the questions we ask are similar. They just need a little bit of modification for use in another context. But once it's done, it's done. We did all of these from 2003 to 2023, all these orders, but we hope to keep updating that data set. And so every year when I add a fresh bunch of orders to the pipeline, I no longer need to go back and go through this process again. The schema is in place, it's ready and waiting and hungry for me to feed it more orders. So the efficiencies get better as you progress on this. But now let's stack these up side by side. So that's an excellent question. Between you and me and the rest of the world who's going to see this recording on the internet, we are now applying this to the CERC to begin with, and we hope to extend this to several state ERCs one by one as well. So we've done the Aptel so far. We've seen performance of the ERC and appeal at Aptel, but we now want to start applying this to the study of ERC orders directly as well. Side by side, here is SEBI and SAT. So we had costs for interns in SEBI, supervision costs in SEBI, and there were inconsistencies and relaying errors when we did that first round, none of which we had to go through for our SAT work. The SEBI work, once done, is done. If I need to redo it through that process, I need a new team. I need to go through that all over again. There's no scalability for future audits. It's not replicable to other regulators. As I said, it's much easier to repurpose what we've done for SAT on the schema to Aptel. The scraping costs of gathering all of these orders from the regulator's website, of course, remains. And for anybody who's tried to work with this kind of information, you know that it's always a good idea to try and have your own easily accessible version of this information than to continuously try and get it from the regulator's website. And so that cost will, of course, remain. But the time is much less. And like I said, the next time we do an SAT round, even quicker. We've started doing this, as I said, for Aptel. That's been much faster than even this 4-month time period that you've got up here. A quick little tidbit from the results that we're trying to work on right now. Remember, the whole story is trying to understand the journey of this decision from the first instance at the SEBI onwards to the SAT and then to the Supreme Court. We've completed one big step here. And so we found 205 instances where there is a particular decision that goes forward to the SAT. We're able to understand what happened there. And there is either a remand or the appeal is allowed fully or in part in about 105 of these instances. So this is work that we're still working on. This is all the analysis that we're undertaking, and we're going to take a little more time, but I'm hoping to reach out to everyone with the results of our work fairly soon, the next few months. And finally, just say a few quick things, very conscious that I have less than 5 minutes left, but we did work with technological experts to do this. This is not expertise that we have in-house, but What we do have is a knowledge of how these regulations work. We have a knowledge of how these documents are structured. And we find that questions, the schema, the queries that you might try to work on benefit immensely from domain expertise. We had much closer interaction with the Lucio team the first time around that we did this with SAT. They wrote large parts of the schema for us, but our team has been training on this, and with every iteration of a schema that we try to develop, from SAT to APTEL to ERCs, we're getting a little more independent at trying to do this ourselves. Every time we do this, we know that there are those errors that occur, we know where they occur, and so we're also able to identify which questions aren't performing that well and focus on tweaking those every time we go along. And so refinements occur iteratively, refinements occur with every version that we run, and we're happy to see that the results keep getting better as we go along. I mentioned that we've done work on the Tamil Nadu ERC last year. This was a manual study. We released our methods describing how we framed the indicators, how we looked for information, so on and so forth. All of that is, of course, on our website. We are committed to releasing similar process manuals for all of our future work as well. And as I said earlier, while we can't share the schema because that doesn't belong to us, what we are very happy to share with anyone who's interested and get your inputs is what are the final prompts that we engineer? What is the final set and sequence of questions that we asked? And if that's helpful to you in your work, that's great. Also, a few side experiments that are going on in the team. Some of you may know that there are a few things that you can do with OpenAI's off-the-shelf GPT offering as well. You can create custom GPTs. There can be a little training that goes in there. And so we're trying to see whether everything that we've learned can also be translated into a few custom GPTs. Can somebody create a custom GPT for studying ERC orders, APTEL orders, SEBI orders, SAT orders, those thickets of regulation that we're surrounded by, and make it available to anybody else who wants to work with it. So as we learn on working through this combination of LLMs that Lucio offers us, we're also trying to see if there's something that we can use outside those systems and something that we can make available to everyone else as well. Thank you very much. I realize I haven't left much time for questions, but I'd be happy to take any.
Thanks a lot, Bhavin. And I think you took a couple of questions en route also. I'm not, did you, there was a question right at the beginning. Can you please share what some of these indicators were by Chandrasekhar B? Maybe you could take that. And anybody else who has any questions, please feel free to unmute yourselves and ask or put it on the chat.
So I was just taking a moment because I thought the best way to show what the indicators are would be by sharing the spreadsheet once again and just zooming in a little bit there. So the indicators that I'm talking about are such as these. What is the appeal number? So remember, these are insider trading matters. What is the name of the company whose securities are involved? What is the name of the party? Who's the counsel? What was the date of the last hearing? So on and so forth. Moving on to, was the impugned order quashed? Was the appeal allowed, partly allowed, dismissed? What was the penalty amount that the AO or WTM imposed? What was the modified penalty amount? So on. And so, as I said, some of these are pure information extraction, dates of orders, names of parties. Some of these help us understand the constituent parts of what's going on. So if you say, for example, about insider trading, did the decision establish that there was UPSI? Yes or no? That's a good question to know. Did it describe the UPSI? Yes or no? That's a good question to know. Each of these is an indicator.
Thank you. Any more? Maybe we can take one more question if somebody has. Vardhan, yeah, why don't you go? Just unmute and go for it.
Yeah, hi. Sorry, I keep asking questions.
No, please go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, Bhavin. Thank you for the presentation. How do you see the use of LLMs generally for substantive interpretation of large documents? Like, do you, in your view of the usage of LLMs, do you see a time frame like 3 to 5 years we'll be able to use for substantial analysis? Thanks.
Sure. I'll try and answer that based on what we've seen and based on what um, our experience has been as a non-technologist. In the 1.5 years that we worked with these systems, we've seen the accuracy results go up substantially. That said, I think that anybody who's interested in getting very high accuracy or near perfect responses should also be paying a lot of attention to those validation and error spotting methods that I described a little while earlier, because I don't know that, or I don't know when there's going to be a situation that you get 100% accurate results out of these. That's no reason at all not to use these systems. But if we are able to concentrate on these downstream processes, on these validations, on these error checks, the question to my mind isn't so much when can we start using them. The question is really, we have been using them for the past year. And then we've done this in the case of SAT and SEBI and Apple, and I think it's a good time to start.
Thanks, Bhavin. I think Varun has a question about have you experimented with any other large language models except for GPT?
Yeah, sure. So important to place upfront that the Lucio platform doesn't use only OpenAI's GPT models. One of the things that the Lucio platform allows us to do is to direct each individual query to a different LLM. Claude, for example, may be better at some things than a GPT-4 or a 4.0 might be. In our own work outside the Lucio system, we have experimented with 2 or 3 different OpenAI models and with the Claude models.
Awesome. Samvid, I'll share all of this information over email to everybody who attended, and also share Bhavin's contact details if anybody wants to reach out to him separately. Thank you so much, everybody who stuck around. I hope all of you found this helpful, and we have one more learning circle coming up in about 2 weeks from now. We'll share an invite officially over email soon. So looking forward to seeing all of you again over there. And yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Bhavin and Trustbridge team, for taking us through this very insightful experiment. Yeah, hope to see all of you soon. Thank you, and have a lovely weekend ahead.